So this is it now. You're at the home straight. You've got your MP3 file, your trailer uploaded, and now it's time to tell Apple Podcasts where to find it. So let's have a quick review of RSS. We talked about it a little bit earlier. As I described, podcasts are largely decentralized. The thing that we upload to services like Apple Podcasts and Spotify is not our MP3 files. We've already done that. What we do is we submit our RSS feed and sometimes a little bit of extra information to these directories. They then make our podcasts searchable. So our show can then be found by people pulling up their phone and searching for it in Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever. So this is all powered by that RSS feed now. As we described before, it is a document. It's a file on the web that is written in a particular language. That language is called XML, and it's simply a way of describing a thing. That's what XML does. It describes things. And there are different agreements between people who write and read XML to say that if you write it in this way, or if you include this information, this code, we understand it to mean this particular thing. So Apple Podcasts has their own standard. There are other standards as well for information that we all agree on. If you write it in this way, then it's a podcast. That includes things like referencing your podcast artwork, the categories that Apple Podcasts uses for its directory. You put those in your RSS feed as well. Information like the description of your show, whether it's explicit or not. Then there's things like the duration of each episode. That goes into your feed as well. Now, your hosting company takes care of all of this for you. You don't have to do it yourself. People used to write this stuff by hand, and then we got people like Libsyn and then other organizations over the years that have helped make this stuff a lot easier. But that is what powers your podcast. It's that RSS feed. And you'll get to know that. You probably won't know it off by heart, but you will see that information a lot at the beginning of your journey with your podcast, because you'll be giving that information out to lots of different people. So you can find your RSS feed URL in your media host. There will be a section. Sometimes there is a distribution section within your host dashboard. It will be in all sorts of different places, but they will make it readily available for you. Anchor hides it because, as we discussed before, they don't want your podcast on the open internet if they can help it. So they will provide it for you, but you've got to jump through a couple of hoops and click OK to a scary message. Which is another reason I don't recommend Anchor. Like I said, though, you submit that RSS feed, not your episode. So what that means is you submit your RSS feed to these services once. You don't have to then do it per episode. You tell them where your podcast is. Your media host updates that RSS file for you, and then that's it. That's all you have to do. So each time you release a new episode, you just upload it to your media host, and then the internet takes care of it all. Now, a quick note is that shortly after releasing your episode to the wild, you will start to receive spam. It is almost, at this point, inevitable. That's because your email address is in your RSS feed. There's one important reason for this, is that it's a way of being able to determine whether you have rights to act on behalf of that podcast. For example, if you choose to submit your podcast to Spotify, which I hope you do, you'll have a Spotify account. You'll need to create a Spotify account. You don't have to pay for it. It's completely free. We'll talk about that in detail in a bit, but you have to have a Spotify account. You don't want some rando with their own account submitting your podcast feed on your behalf, because then they get to see your stats and they get to manage it, and that's no good, right? So a way of Spotify knowing that you are in control of this podcast is by sending you a link to click or a confirmation code for you to enter. And so that's all done with your RSS feed. So your email address is stored in your feed. Because RSS feeds are information that is available on the open web, for example, if you search the Apple Podcasts directory, if you are a nerd with the skills, you can search the Apple Podcasts directory. You can get the feed, the RSS feed URL for a podcast, and then you can find the email address. That's something now that less than scrupulous companies have started to do. So you will start to get spam. It's at the beginning, it is highly unlikely that an email that tells you about a wonderful guest that you should have on your podcast, it's highly unlikely in the first few months of your podcast that is a legit email. I mean, it's, the guest may well be legit, but they've probably never heard your podcast and they don't know what it is. So you, in most cases, send straight to spam. So, apps and directories then. Apple Podcasts is a directory. It also is an app. There's the Podcasts app for iOS and also for the desktop as well. There's the iTunes app in Windows, which also plays podcasts. Podcasts can be played on Apple TVs as well. And there's a proliferation of apps that all use the directory, the Apple Podcasts directory. Now, it is Apple Podcasts. I keep saying Apple Podcasts, and I know it's clumsy and cumbersome that I keep having to say it, but it is Apple Podcasts, not iTunes. It hasn't been called iTunes for years now, and yet still people do tend to call it iTunes. So you will make Apple happier and minutely increase the likelihood that they will like your podcast and maybe help you, get it featured at some point. If you make sure to call it Apple Podcasts and not Spotify. Don't do that when you're talking about, do that when you're actually recording your episodes. If you're asking for reviews or telling people where they can find it, let them know they can find it on Apple Podcasts, not iTunes. And the Apple Podcasts app serves around 35% of the listening audience currently, vying for the top spot. And depending on who you listen to, and at different times of the year, they go up and down here. But Spotify is around 25% of the listening market. Now, you see, this is interesting, isn't it? Because earlier I mentioned in a previous lesson that most people have Android phones, yet Apple Podcasts is not available on Android. This is one of these weird, interesting discrepancies and a lovely moment in the podcasting ecosystem. Because while most people in the world have Android phones rather than iOS, most listening is still done in Apple Podcasts, which means most listening is still done in iPhones. However, that is changing, as evidenced by the 25% market share that that Spotify now has. It's creeping up, and it is taking that. The reason it's able to grow so quickly, one of them, is because it's taking all of those listeners who were previously fragmented and didn't have one single place where they could find podcasts, and it's giving them a place that is platform agnostic. So that's why it's at 25%. Other directories that we have or apps that we have are Google Podcasts and Amazon Music, Pocket Casts and Podcast Addict. Then we've got Deezer, Gaana and JioSaavn. Those two, the last two, are Indian podcast directories. And then we've got Stitcher and TuneIn, which are sort of legacy directories. And then there is also the Podcast Index, which is a directory that powers different apps. So if we look at things like Pocket Casts or a better example actually is something like Castro and Overcast, which are two iOS apps. They use the Apple Podcasts directory. So when you search for a podcast in one of those apps, you're searching Apple's directory. Pocket Casts and Podcast Addict have their own directories that they maintain themselves. Deezer and Gaana and JioSaavn, they are big streaming platforms like Spotify, so they have their own apps and their own ecosystems. Stitcher and TuneIn are the same. They are directories in and of themselves that also have apps. The Podcast Index is just a directory in and of itself. It doesn't have an app. There are an increasing number of mostly Android, but also some iOS apps that use the Podcast Index as the search mechanism. So it's a really good idea to be listed in the Podcast Index as well, because there is an increasing number of podcast players that are using that. It's an independent index. So obviously Apple's index is under Apple's control. If they decide for whatever reason that they want to remove a show from their directory, they can do. The podcast index is meant to be a censorship-resistant directory, so they don't make those kinds of decisions. Apps can choose to hide something in search if they want to, but the podcast index won't kick something out. So let's look at Apple in a little bit more detail then. The first thing you want to do to set up your podcast in Apple is to create an Apple ID, which you can do at appleid.apple.com. Then you can sign in to podcastsconnect.apple.com, which is the place that you will go to submit podcasts. Sadly, they are the biggest, and they do present the biggest bottleneck, unfortunately. You've sort of got to be here, and you've got to suck it up. It's not... I mean, it's a process. It's not the worst thing in the world, but... you have got to sort of jump through their hoops in order to do this. You need to agree to their terms and conditions, and then you can add your podcast using the RSS feed URL that your media host gives you. You will also be asked for some additional information. It wants to know how frequently you intend to put out episodes, and to double check that you have rights to use any music that you've chosen. You can then submit your podcast for validation, which typically takes a matter of minutes. It used to take days, and it's now sort of rather an automated process. And then you will be live and searchable within 24 hours. So once you've submitted for validation, you're pretty much there within about an hour, and you'll get your Apple Podcasts URL. So you'll get that link that you can then link up on your website so that the button clicks through to Apple Podcasts, right? You'll get that within about an hour. But you won't be searchable in the index. You won't be searchable by people pulling out their phones and typing your podcast name into their app for about 24 hours. That process takes longer. So if we look at Spotify then, Spotify for podcasters, they may do the host submission for you. So they, unfortunately, no host can do it with Apple, but your media host may do this for you on your behalf if... at your consent, and they'll do that submission process. But if you want to do it yourself, or if they don't provide that option, then you can set up a free Spotify account at spotify.com, and then head to podcasters.spotify.com, sign in, and then you'll find a menu item to add or claim your podcast. Again, you will enter the RSS feed that you get from your media host. There'll be a verification step to follow. So we talked about the email address being in your feed. That's what they'll do. They'll email, make sure that you have control over that feed, enter in the code that they ask you to, and then you'll be live in their directory within minutes. You'll get your link that you can then link up your Spotify button on your website. Again, same kind of caveat applies when it comes to searchability. It will take longer for your podcast to be searchable within Spotify, but if you've got the link, you can take your prospective followers directly to your Spotify page. Quick note on Google Podcasts then. They're a bit of a mess. They try to auto-discover podcast feeds based on websites. If yours is a new show, then you're just best doing it yourself. They kind of do a bad job of it, so the best thing to do is just go to their website and handle it all. It's an unholy mess outside of the US. They're getting themselves tied in knots with EU regulations. They're panicking about not being able to verify the age of people. So basically what happens is you find any podcast within Google and it says it's not available because they've tied themselves in knots around if they don't think they can be certain that you're over 18, then they just don't show any podcasts. The whole thing's a mess. However, it's not a silly idea to be listed within, and it's actually not an overly arduous task. But just know that around 3% of people are using it, according to Buzzsprout, who share their stats on a regular basis. But podcastsmanager.google.com is where you can go to submit your feed and try your luck. It's the actual submission process is easy. You just, again, pop in your feed, do the validation step, and you'll be there, and then searchable much later. But whether anyone will actually find your podcast, it's who knows. I'm afraid. Amazon Music is a little bit more sensible. It's good for Echo devices. That's pretty much what it's for. It's no one really that in my experience has any relationship with Amazon and podcasting outside of the Echo ecosystem, or the ecosystem, if you like. You can let your host submit it for you, and it usually takes, again, about 24 hours to make your show searchable. It's a not unfriendly process. The big rule with all of this stuff is to be everywhere. As much as I have, and I've said Google's a nightmare and people use this, but doesn't matter. Be everywhere. There's no reason not to be in every conceivable directory. Lots of apps, as I said, use Apple's index. There's apps like Overcast and Castro and various other apps that use Apple's index. So make sure that you are first and foremost listed with Apple. Some apps are using the podcast index, so it takes very little time to submit your feed to the podcast index. So absolutely do that as well. There's a list of directories that you can submit to, along with full submission instructions, over on the Podcode website, and that is linked below in the description of this lesson. So there we go. Your homework then, your final piece of homework, is to get your RSS feed URL from your media host. Submit that URL to Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and then do the auto submission process with any of the directories. If your host has, for example, Captivate has like a one-click button, and it will go and spray the internet with your RSS feed. With other hosts, you might have to do a bit more of a manual process. But go and do that. Get your podcast feed everywhere. And check out our directory list for more, because your host might not list all of the ones. There are other hosts, as I say, like GeoSarv and even the older ones like Stitcher and TuneIn. That's not a bad place, not a bad idea to be there as well. So go through that process and then take a bow, because you have just launched a podcast. Now, you may be thinking, that trailer, you're telling me to submit that to Apple Podcasts and the rest. It's not great. I thought this was just a test. Absolutely. If you're lacking in sort of in that confidence, then I've got two things to say. First off, you can wait until you've got something that you feel a bit more polished, and absolutely go through that process. That's fine. But the second thing, the really important thing that I want to mention is, just being in those directories will not make your podcast found. It is not a build it and they will come scenario. It just means that when people come to search for your show by name, you are there. Your show's not going to get stumbled upon. If that happened, there wouldn't be a cliched phrase within podcasting that it has a discoverability problem. If your show was stumbled upon, then we'd be in a different position. So you can be pretty confident that you can upload your audio, and you can wait until you've got something better. But get yourself in those directories now, and then it's done and over with. And then when you come to have some audio that you really want to promote, then, my friend, we have courses available for you. So the next thing you might want to consider is checking out the Editing in Descript course. Give that a look, and you can then go through the process of actually producing regular episodes. You can also use it to produce your trailer as well. If you want to integrate music and do a bit more polish, you can do all of that in Descript as well. And we've, of course, got a course to take you through that entire process. And then after that, we have a course on getting your first 1,000 listeners. So what do you do once you've actually got that audio uploaded and submitted to Apple Podcasts? How do we get people listening? That is a discussion for another day. But for now, well done. Hit that green button and we will wrap everything up.